When we think about the great world-shaping empires of the ancient world, our minds almost immediately jump to the Romans, the Persians, or maybe the Greeks, right? But chronologically, long before every single name you know, there was Assyria. In this explainer, we're going to look at the civilization that quite literally invented the blueprint for the entire empire business.
It's a pretty profound question, and it completely reframes our understanding of ancient history. We give Rome so much credit for their military genius, and we praise Persia for their incredible administration. But honestly, the Assyrian Empire laid the foundation for all of it. They were the world's very first true military superpower. To see how they actually pulled this off, we're going to unpack their strategy. We'll cover the world's first professional army, their invention of combined arms and siege tactics, their calculated use of terror, the massive deportation machine, how they surprisingly preserved ancient knowledge, and finally, their shockingly sudden collapse. So, let's dive right into part one, the professional army, which was an absolute world first. Picture how wars used to be fought. Before Assyria, an army was essentially just a bunch of farmers. They were conscripted to fight temporary battles during the agricultural off-season. But in the 8th century BCE, King Tiglath-Pileser III completely flipped the script. He disbanded those seasonal militias and created the world's first true, paid, year-round standing army. Almost overnight, Assyria had a massive force of career soldiers, ready to fight at a moment's notice. And they weren't just professionals. They were technologically way ahead of the curve. The Assyrians ditched bronze and started using iron on a massive industrial scale. Iron was cheaper, it was harder, and you could mass produce it to outfit a huge fighting force. We're talking iron swords, iron spear blades, iron scales literally sewn into their tunics. But you know what their most enduring invention might actually be? The military boot. They created these thick-soled, knee-high leather boots fitted with iron shin plates. That meant the Assyrian army could march and fight on any terrain, in any weather, all year long. Moving on to part two, combined arms and the siege engine. Okay, so having a massive, well-equipped army is one thing, but how did they actually use it? Imagine standing on an ancient battlefield and seeing this charging right at you. The Assyrians absolutely perfected the heavy shock charge using these massive four-horse chariots. They were basically the ancient equivalent of tanks, mobile missile platforms thundering across the plains, completely shattering the defensive lines before the infantry even got there. And they didn't just throw bodies at the enemy. They pioneered what we now call combined arms. It worked like a highly coordinated machine. First, the chariots would strike and punch a hole in the enemy line. Second, cavalry, which the Assyrians introduced on a massive scale, would exploit that breach and sweep around to attack from the rear. And finally, highly disciplined infantry would push forward, entirely covered by a relentless storm of arrows and slingshots from behind. But what do you do when the enemy just hides behind a giant city wall? Well, the Assyrians practically invented the dedicated engineering corps. They built covered battering rams, multi-story wheeled siege towers, and massive earthen ramps, like the famous one at Lachish, which is literally still there today. From that exact moment in human history, city walls were absolutely no longer a safe haven. Now things get a bit dark in part 3, Terror as Official Policy. We have to talk about the brutal reality of Assyrian statecraft. Just listen to this actual historical record. Quote, "I flayed all the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes." Ugh, that was King Ashurbanipal. The Assyrians built a global reputation for unadulterated, horrific terror. But here is what's crucial to understand. This cruelty wasn't just random, chaotic madness. It was a highly calculated policy of information warfare, happening some 2,700 years ago. They would carve these incredibly graphic scenes of torture straight into the stone walls of their palaces. So when foreign diplomats came to visit, they literally had to walk past these visual warnings. It was state-sponsored propaganda, specifically designed to terrify subject nations so much that they wouldn't even dare to launch a secondary rebellion. Which brings us to part 4, the deportation machine. Because when psychological terror didn't work, the Assyrians rolled out a meticulously calculated backup plan. They systematically and forcefully relocated conquered peoples. King Tiglath-Pileser III basically standardized this process of moving entire nations. But you have to realize, this wasn't some chaotic refugee crisis. It was a massive, highly organized logistical operation run by the state. The actual mechanics of this deportation machine are fascinating. They transported these deportees safely and comfortably, and they went out of their way to keep families intact. Why? Well, because these people were specifically handpicked for their skills. They were craftsmen, farmers, soldiers. By uprooting them, the Assyrians immediately crushed local resistance at the source. And, at the exact same time, they maximized the economic output of those skilled workers in new provinces, eventually integrating them right into the empire. Now, to manage an empire of this unbelievable size, you need serious infrastructure. So they built vast highway systems, they secured river crossings, and they created a highly efficient relay network just for messengers. This machinery of control was the exact blueprint that the later Persian and Roman empires simply copied and pasted to run their own territories.
Let's pivot to part 5, preserving the ancient world.
This is arguably the greatest historical paradox of the entire Assyrian Empire. The very same empire that openly bragged about burning cities to the ground and flaying rebels is also responsible for one of the most important cultural achievements in human history. King Ashurbanipal created the world's first large-scale, state-sponsored library at Nineveh. He was completely obsessed with collecting and copying tens of thousands of clay tablets. So, ironically, the most brutal empire in history is the main reason so much ancient knowledge actually survived for us to study today.
Finally, part 6, sudden collapse, eternal legacy.
Because, as we know, no empire lasts forever. But the fall of Assyria is perhaps the most shocking and abrupt end of a superpower we have on record. 20 years. Just think about that for a second. After completely dominating the Near East for centuries, it took a mere 2 decades for this unbeatable empire to completely vanish, all kicked off by a devastating internal civil war.
That civil war severely weakened them from the inside out, and it left the front door wide open. In 612 BCE, a massive, vengeful coalition, made up of the very people they had previously terrorized, the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians, finally united. They sacked the capital city of Nineveh and burned it to the ground so thoroughly that for centuries, people honestly weren't even sure if the great city had ever existed at all. Which leaves us with a truly provocative question to wrap up this explainer. The Assyrians were wiped off the map, sure, but their ideas absolutely were not. Everything from the year-round professional army and combined arms to siege engines, provincial administration, and massive highway networks, it all started right here. So it really makes you wonder, if Assyria hadn't written the operational manual for how to run an empire, would the great powers of Persia, Greece, or Rome have ever risen to the heights they did? Just who were the true architects of the ancient world?